Hello and welcome back everyone to yet another lesson in web development. Today we're going to continue with our core project, and in today's session we are going to link our front end stack with our back end stack, the stack that we've been working on throughout the last couple of lessons. So with that being said, let's have a look at the objectives for today's lesson. Now we really only have two objectives for today's lesson. As mentioned before, we will be linking the front-end architecture of our website with our database, and that is to ensure that we can update the front end using persistent data, which will be extracted from our database and displayed on the front end. So without further ado, let's dive right in and let's start scripting. Now, if we take a moment to revisit our dashboard that we created in our JavaScript portion of this course, you'll notice that everything is pretty much stock standard as we left it. And previously, we could essentially just add employees over here. So we could essentially just add in Jack, Stevens. The position could be something like marketing. And we could even add a department over here, such as the marketing department, of course. And then lastly, we could also add things like the salary as well as our email. So let's just go ahead and do that. So js@jcoaches.com. And then lastly, we could also just add a salary over here. So the idea behind this is that the moment we confirm, the record gets added. And that's all good and well, but keep in mind that this data is just not persistent. And when working with databases, this allows us the opportunity to make sure that the data persists. So if I refresh this now, that record disappears. This is something we demonstrated previously, but it's important to highlight, especially because we want to see the difference in what happens when we actually refresh our dashboard and we actually want to see that data remain intact. So essentially what we want to have happen is if we head over to our local host, our PHP myadmin, if we have a look at our employee data over here, you'll notice that everything is intact, much like we expect. One thing we could do just to rectify this to make sure it's in line with what we have here is swap Jessica's last name and first name around. So we can essentially click on edit over here. And this also allows you an opportunity to play with the UI of PHP myadmin if you don't want to work with SQL. So I'll just cut this out. I'll add in Bloom over here and Jessica over here. Now, this is not something you have to do, but again, if you want to make sure that everything is in line with what we have here, feel free to go ahead and just update that single record of data. So I'll hit go over here, and now if you look, everything should be just fine. So again, what we want to have happen is show all this data in our front end and make sure that that data persists. There are things we won't include, and this includes things such as the employee number, for example, and the department code. In fact, when we pass in the department code under the departments field over here, we can automatically create a join to have the department name reflect instead. And that is something we'll actually do in today's session. So let's hop into Atom and review our boilerplate code. Now that we have Atom booted up, there are two important things that I think are really worth mentioning. The first thing is that as we progress with the next couple of lessons, it's quite important that you are very familiar, or at least familiar with the basics of PHP. So do feel free to revisit our previous lessons where we had a bunch of lessons dedicated just to PHP. The second thing is that if we have a look at my project structure, and that is to say, if we have a look at the way that the project is structured in my XAMPP htdocs folder under L6, you'll notice that I have my file saved as an index.html file. Now, because we are going to be working on a PHP server, we have to rename this file to have an extension of .php. So those are two things to be mindful of. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply just going to minimize this slightly. And then what I'll do is I'll come one level up in this folder in my htdocs. Remember, this is usually stored in your C drive or wherever it is that you installed XAMPP. I'm going to grab this and I'm going to drag it in over here. Then I'm going to open up this file. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to save this file as a PHP document instead of an HTML HTML document. And to do this, I'll simply navigate to Save As, and then I'll change the extension over here to PHP. Great, I'll save this, and we can actually get rid of the HTML one because they are duplicate documents and we no longer need the HTML document. We certainly need the PHP document in the event that we want to serve this script over a server. So I'll just click on the HTML document over here and simply click delete. It will ask you if you would like to move this to trash. You can simply say yes. So now we have our PHP document, and this is the one we're going to be working from. So let's quickly have a look at our boilerplate code. You'll notice for the most part, this is exactly the same code as when we worked on the HR system and when we completed the HR system and the dashboard. There are a couple of tweaks here and there, and I decided to get rid of a couple of things like IDs that I'm not necessarily using in my JS code or in my CSS code. So do take note of that. Also, I will be making the source code available to all of you in your summary notes so that you can practice all the code in this lesson. So we have a couple of list items over here, and we also have our employee cards. The list items over here are the interview cards for adding interviews to our HR dashboard. Today, we really just want to focus on optimizing and working on the employee cards. And that is to say that instead of pulling our employee cards through JavaScript like we've done over here in our previous lesson, we want to handle all of that using PHP. So let's get started with our first PHP script. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a handler. So I'll do that within the L6 folder over here. So let's just expand that. I'll go ahead and say new file, and then I'm going to save this as, and I'm simply going to call this something like db-inc for include.php. And you can think of this file, this script, as my credentials used to access the database, but this is essentially going to be a PHP script. So what I know from PHP is I can simply just start typing PHP. I'll get my brackets over here, and then I'm going to create a couple of variables. The first one is going to be db-serve name, and this is going to be equal to localhost, like this. And then we need to close this off. Remember, PHP is very, very pedantic when it comes to adding your semicolon. So do make sure that you add them in at the end. Then I'm going to create a new variable called db name. I'm going to set this equal to root. And then I'm going to create two more variables. The next one is going to be db password, or dbpwd for db password. And I'm going to leave this as blank because throughout the last couple of lessons, as we worked with our database, we never really created any strong credentials to protect our database. And the reason for that is because we are still working locally. So there is no need, well, at least in this case, to add a password. And then I'm going to add db name over here. This is the name of the database we are going to be accessing. And in our case, this is called hr.db, and then I'll close this off as well. So just to confirm the credentials over here, we can actually hop over to our client. And if we have a look at our database credentials, so if you click on hr-db and you head over to privileges, you can actually find the credentials over here, the username being root, for example. That is our db uname credential. We also have a server name, which is localhost, which is our local machine. We never added a password, so we know that's the case. And we also know that the database that we are trying to access is hr-db. So you can think of my handler, the one that we just created. You can think of the handler over here, or the helper is what other developers, or a helper is what some developers might refer to as a way to connect to our database by using the credentials. Now there is another variable, and this is going to be the final variable for the script. And this one is going to be called database connection, or db connection. I'm going to set this equal to an object in PHP called mysqli_connect. So I'm storing this function or this method inside of this variable so that we can use it at a later stage. I'll then open up over here, and then I'll simply just add in all the variables that I created in a specific order. The first parameter in order to connect to the database is going to be the database server name. So DB serve name. Next we'll have DB uname or username. Then we'll have another one over here called DB password. So DB PWD. And then lastly, we'll have our final variable DB name over here. So these are all the credentials needed to access this method, and then essentially we store this method into a variable so that we can use it at a later stage. Let's just close this off over here, and that's basically it for our helper. So we can go ahead and save this now. Now we can head over to our index PHP script, and we can start scripting the actual PHP used to get the data from our database and store it in our front end. So let's go ahead and do exactly that. Now in my index PHP file, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some PHP code. And the first code I'm going to add is right at the top of my document that was an HTML document. So I'll say PHP, and I'll have an opening and a closing tag. And I'm going to include this thing called include underscore once. And what this is going to do is it's going to take in a script. And the script that I'm going to import here is going to be db-inc or include.php. Now this is essentially the script that we just created. So let's save this. And the script that we are using here, like we said, is going to be this one that we just created, our handler. And what this one line of code does is it essentially looks for a script called db-inc.php in the same folder where the index.php script is placed, and it imports all the code that has been written here. All this code is now being imported into my index.php. And what that means is that I can start using this handler inside of my index.php. This is important because I need these credentials over here so that I can work with the database in a different script. Excellent. So now the next step is to include more PHP code so that we can actually start dialing into our database. So I'm looking for a specific tag over here, and the one I'm looking for is the employee list. So I've got employee card, then over here I have employee list, which is a div container that essentially takes in the 4 list items from our website. Remember, each and every single employee had a card. So if we navigate back to our browser, if we have a look over here, this gray area is essentially my div container or my list. And each of these were cards that we created using front-end technology. Now we're going to try and recreate these cards with a bit of an exception using our PHP server and our database. So let's head back over to Atom. Now that we've designated our list, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give all of this a bit of space over here. These cards will still generate, and we'll keep them there for now, these list items or these cards, but we are also going to dynamically generate them from the database. So in order to do this, I need to create another PHP tag over here to embed PHP code. And next, I'm going to create a SQL statement. Much like when we create a SQL statement in the PHP My Admin environment, I'm going to create a SQL statement over here. So I'm simply going to go $SQL statement like this. And I'm going to set this equal to a new statement. Now, before I decide to go and actually write a single line of code over here, I'm going to copy and paste what I already have, given that we are quite familiar with SQL and how to create joins and how to select things from a database. In fact, we'll actually use the select statement and see what kind of data we are retrieving. So I'll simply just copy and then paste that over here. And this is the SQL statement that we are actually going to run in our PHP environment. So if I grab all of this over here, also just want to add that semicolon, given that it's still PHP. And you'll notice that it's one long line of code that I decided not to type out from scratch, but instead to show you what this code actually retrieves when we run it. So on my HRDB, if I go under the SQL table over here, I also just have to remove the quotation marks because this was formatted for PHP. And now if we have a look at the code, what we are essentially doing is retrieving the first name from the employees table, the last name from the employees table, the job title from employees table, the department, from the departments table, very, very important, and the employee's email from the employees table, and lastly, the salary from the employees table. And then we are creating a join between the employees table and the departments table, and the join, the one thing these two tables have in common is the department code, and this is how we are establishing that join from the employees table as well as the departments table. Now, if we run this code, this is the result that we get. This is the table and the rows that we are retrieving. So first name, last name, job title, department name, email, and salary. Also take note of the table column names. This is quite important when running your SQL code. Now, what we are essentially going to do is take all of this from the database over here, and we're going to plant it into these cards so that the data is being retrieved from our database and not so much our JavaScript and HTML code. So now heading back over into Atom, given that we now have our query string over here, we can actually start structuring our database query. So on a new line over here, I'm going to create a new variable called query result. And this is going to store any result of a query that I'm trying to run through SQL. So I'm going to set this equal to a method in PHP called MySQLi underscore query. So this is the query. And to run this query, I need two parameters. The first one is the database connection. So DB connection. And if you're asking yourself, where are we getting this from? Do recall that in our DB includes script over here, we have a stored variable, and we basically imported that when we used the include once keyword at the top of our script. The second parameter that we need to store here is the actual SQL statement. So that is going to be the SQL statement that we created at the top over here. And that is basically it, just to build a simple query. Next, I'm going to create a variable to maintain the result. So I'll say result check over here. And this is going to be equal to another PHP method called MySQLi underscore num underscore rows. And this is just going to store the result of any rows that I'm fetching from my database. And this takes in one parameter, and the parameter here is going to be the actual query. So this is going to be the query result that we created at the top over here. Excellent. So now that we have these two lines out of the way, I'm also going to create another variable just as a currency so that we can concatenate that currency at a later stage. So I'll call this currency, and this is going to be concatenated with our salary at a later stage. And this is going to be equal to the pound, and that is that. So for the most part, we are fairly much done with just our query, but now we want to make sure that our result that we get from our database after running the query actually has some data. And if it has some data, we want to perform some sort of operation. So what I'm going to do next is create a simple if statement over here, and this is going to be if result check is greater than 0. This means that we have results after running the query. Then do something. And the thing I want to do is run a simple while loop that's just going to fetch the data and echo some statement or code out. So what I'll say here is I'll create a variable called row, and inside this row, with every result being fetched from my database, we need to call MySQLi underscore fetch associative, or ASSOC. This just basically means that take the results that you're getting and create an associative array. This is quite important. We have discussed associative arrays in previous lessons of PHP, so do take a moment to refresh your memory. So inside of here, I'm going to store the query result, and that is basically it. Now the next thing I want to do is that in the event that we've transformed our data into an associative array, we also want to perform some sort of operation. And again, that is just to echo out some code to the screen. So to accomplish this, I'm going to open up some curly braces over here for my while loop. And I want you to take note of something. In our JavaScript file, our main.js file, what we did with JavaScript when we printed out new cards when the user added a new card, we simply just appended all of this HTML text over here, and we appended all of this using the insert adjacent HTML method in JavaScript. We are going to take a slightly different approach when it comes to using PHP, but for the most part, the code is going to remain somewhat more or less the same. So I'm going to grab this list item, copy it, and then back in PHP over here, I'm going to create a echo statement, and I'm also going to give this some real estate. So let's just clean up our code nicely over here. So let's just bump all of this down, and then I'm simply going to echo out that code. I'm also going to wrap this in quotation marks like this, and now we need to go and start replacing a couple of these things, and we need to start refactoring some of the things in our code over here. So how exactly do we do that? Well, we have to be careful and we have to be cognizant of double quotation and single quotation marks, and we also have to ensure that we are retrieving the correct data from our associative array over here. So let's just save this, and I'm going to start doing a bit of refactoring. The first thing I'm going to do is my employee card over here, I'm going to make sure I'm using single quotes, and then on the user image I'm going to do the exact same thing, and this is just to escape certain characters so that we don't have to worry about getting an error in our output. And then likewise, I'm going to do the same over here, and for this one as well, and then for our alt as well. And then I'm just going to replace everything else that has a double quotation mark, so you can follow along with me. So employee details as well. And then I'm going to move on to name font. Let's just clean all of this up. And then likewise with name format here as well. I'll maintain the backticks here for the time being, and then eventually we'll start replacing this as we go through our associative array. So what we could possibly do, just to speed everything up, is perhaps just delete all of this. So everything in between backticks, including the backticks, we need to start deleting those things, right? And likewise with the surname over here, the position over here, the department, the email, as well as the salary, including our pound sign over here. So what do we do next? Well, now we can start including double quotation marks so that we can actually include our rows. So the first one over here, I'm going to include double quotation marks, and then I'm going to concatenate in PHP using the full stop sign. I'll call that $row. And what I'm looking for, the key pair value that I'm looking for here, comes directly from my database, and this is going to be first name. So you might be asking yourself, where are we getting this value from? It's also just complete concatenation here. Let's save this. This first name over here is being associated with the row that we are calling from our SQL code over here. So we'll be calling first name, last name, job title, department name, and so on. And we're going to start plugging in those values over here. So what I'll do is just copy this over here, and let's just grab our quotation marks, copy, paste, and I'm going to change this to last name. And then the next thing I'm going to include is the job title. So in between these span tags over here, I'll simply just grab this, copy, paste, and here we'll have job title. And again, job title is our key to access the data that we're getting from here. And we append that to our row again because we have an associative array over here. This is quite important. When you actually see all of this on the screen, it's going to make a lot more sense. And then inside of our email, we'll do exactly the same. So I'll just grab all of this over here, paste this over here, and I'll rename this to department name first of all, before we do our email. So department name, and then we'll do email. For this one over here, I'll simply just rename this to email. And then lastly, we have salary at the bottom over here. So I'll change this to salary. We'll save that. make sure our code looks just fine and everything looks good. We also want to make sure that we just concatenate that currency that we created over here, the strings that we can append it to our currency. So what I'll do is full stop over here, $ currency for the currency variable that we created, and attach that or pin that to the row, or concatenate if you will. And if I save this and have one more look, everything looks fine in terms of my PHP code. Let's also just be certain to close off our PHP code over here with a semicolon, and let's save that. And let's have one last look at our DB include file to make sure that we have no bugs that are going to crop up. So we have DB server name, DB name, DB password, and then we have DB name twice. So there is one bug over here. We've got DB name twice, where one of these are supposed to be the DB username or the username of our database that we are dialing into. And that one over here is going to be the root. So we can actually just rename this over here by simply adding the correct variable name. That is DBU name, and that has to reflect the second variable that we're passing as a parameter over here, and everything else looks good. Save that, hit back to index, and fingers crossed, let's hope our code runs without any errors. So now we're going to head back into our client and make sure that we are retrieving all of these records successfully without the use of JavaScript. However, what we do expect to have happen is to actually see these cards as well, the cards that we created using JavaScript. So I'm going to head back over to the client over here, and then I'm going to run a search on my localhost, and this is the one that I was looking for. And voila, there you go. Everything is exactly as we expected. We've got the job description, we have the department, we've got the email address, we also have the salaries, and so on. You will notice that we have lost a little bit of functionality or features over here, in that we don't have the images popping up, and that's because we don't have the images stored on our server, or we don't have the images in our code, which allows us to generate these images dynamically. However, I do encourage you to attempt this as an exercise. So for the most part, it seems like everything is working just fine. In our next lesson, we're going to start updating everything that we see over here dynamically by adding an employee over here. So when we add an employee over here, what we want to have happen is for a new record to be inserted over here, and for those changes to take effect over here. If you really want to clean this up and start fresh, what you could do is head back over to Atom environment, and inside of our index PHP, we could just clean this up. Let's just clear this up nicely, and then everything outside of that PHP tag that we created. So for our employee cards, let's also just clean this up, bring this right back. So for this card over here, which ends over here, this card over here, which ends over here, likewise this one that starts over here and ends there, and then we have our last card over here. We can essentially just remove all of those cards because we no longer need them. The reason for this is because we are generating all that data from our server now. So if I delete this and I save this and I head back over to my client environment over here, if I refresh this now, you'll notice that I have all the records intact as I wanted, and we're no longer generating hard-coded data from the client side. And that is it for today's lesson. In our next lesson, we'll actually start adding data via our form over here and have everything generated dynamically. So for all of that and more, I'll see you soon. Cheers.